London, 1788. The city is alive, but not in the way you imagine. This is not the London of glittering palaces or polite afternoon teas. This is the other London, a maze of narrow alleys and crumbling brick walls, where the air smells of soot and rotting bread, where the sound of carriage wheels mixes with coughing children and the cries of the hungry. And somewhere among them, hidden in the fog, walks a girl named Mary Wade. She is small, barefoot, and invisible to the world that has already decided her worth. She is 13 years old, and she is starving. The streets of Westminster were no place for a child. They were places of survival. You didn't play here. You endured. The Thames was black with filth. Rats the size of cats darted between piles of refuse. Smoke from coal fires hung so thick that the sun often disappeared. For the poor, every day was a wager between hunger and hope. Mary's father, Lawrence Wade, carried stones, dug ditches, and broke his back for pennies. Her mother, Mary Smith, washed other people's clothes until her hands bled. But still, there was never enough. Not for food, not for shoes, not even for warmth in the winter. When life leaves you no choices, you learn to take them. And so, one cold morning, Mary and her friend Jane Whiting, barely older than she was, did what many others had done before. They stole a small bundle of children's clothes, a cotton frock, a scarf, a linen cap. It was an act of desperation, not malice. A few pieces of fabric that might buy them a meal, maybe two. But in the eyes of 18th century England, it was enough to mark them as criminals. Because this was the age of the Bloody Code, a brutal legal system where more than 200 crimes, from theft to forgery to cutting down a tree, could earn you the gallows. And for a 13-year-old girl, there was no mercy. Mary Wade was caught, arrested, and dragged through the filthy streets to Newgate Prison, a place that made even grown men weep. Newgate was hell wrapped in stone. Its walls oozed damp. The corridors stank of decay. Prisoners slept on straw, crawling with lice. Men, women, and children all crammed together, their coughs echoing off the cold walls. Disease was constant. Food was a privilege. Hope was rare. For a child, it must have felt like the end of the world. But the worst was still to come. In January 1789, Mary stood before the Old Bailey, the same courtroom that had sentenced hundreds before her. She had no lawyer, no defense, no chance. The trial lasted minutes. The verdict: guilty. The sentence: death by hanging. Imagine it, a girl who hadn't yet lived long enough to know kindness, now condemned to die. She was sent back to her cell, to wait for the day the guards would come for her. Days turned into weeks. Each sunrise could have been her last. And in the silence of the night, when she heard the iron gates open and footsteps echoing through the corridors, she must have wondered, is it me they've come for this time? But then, something changed. For reasons lost to time, perhaps mercy, perhaps politics, someone decided that Mary Wade, the condemned thief, was too young to hang. Her sentence was commuted from death to transportation for life. It sounded like salvation, but it wasn't. Transportation meant being banished forever. It meant being chained below deck on a ship and sent to the farthest corner of the world, to a land barely even mapped, where survival itself was uncertain. For Mary, the sentence of life was another kind of death. But she didn't know that yet. In the summer of 1789, she was taken from Newgate, marched to the docks, and placed aboard a ship called the Lady Juliana, one of hundreds of convict vessels that carried Britain's unwanted to its newest and harshest colony, New South Wales. The newspapers in London mocked it, calling it the floating brothel. To them, it was a scandal. To Mary, it was a floating prison, a coffin of timber and iron that would carry her thousands of miles from everything she had ever known. She was just 14 years old. As the ropes were untied and the ship began to drift away from the gray shores of England, Mary might have stood on the deck, looking back at the faint outline of London disappearing into the mist, the only home she had ever known fading into nothing. She didn't know it yet, but she would never see England again. She didn't know that her story would become part of something much larger, that the name Mary Wade, once spoken only in the echo of a courtroom, would one day be remembered across an entire continent. What began as a punishment would become a legacy, and in that moment, somewhere between the rolling waves and the dying light, the world forgot about Mary Wade, but history would not. The wooden hull groaned as the tide lifted her. The year was 1789, and the ship Lady Juliana was about to set sail, not for adventure, not for discovery, but for exile. On board were 226 women, most of them convicts. London's press sneered at them, calling them abandoned creatures, the refuse of humanity, and the floating brothel. But behind those cruel words were lives that had once dreamed, loved, and struggled, now reduced to numbers on a manifest. And among them was Mary Wade, just 14 years old, a girl too young to die, but old enough to be forgotten. The docks of Plymouth were chaos that summer. The smell of tar and salt mixed with the stench of desperation. Chains clinked as the women were herded aboard, guards shouting orders, sailors cursing under their breath. For many, this was their first time seeing the sea. The ship loomed above them like a beast, its masts stretching into the fog. Mary didn't know it then, but she was about to embark on one of the longest and most grueling voyages in British maritime history, nearly a full year across half the planet. As the sails caught the wind and the coastline began to fade, silence fell among the women. England was behind them. The endless ocean was ahead. There was no turning back. Below deck, the air was thick and foul. The women slept in narrow wooden bunks, pressed shoulder to shoulder. The heat was unbearable. The smell of sweat and salt water clung to everything. Rats scurried across the floorboards. Water was rationed carefully. Bread went stale within days, and salted meat grew slimy with mold. Sickness spread easily. Dysentery, fever, and infection were constant companions. At night, the ship creaked and swayed. The waves pounded against the hull like distant drums. For Mary, each night felt like a lifetime, drifting between fear and exhaustion. But the Lady Juliana was no ordinary convict ship. Its captain, Thomas Edgar, was different. Unlike many who commanded such vessels, Edgar allowed the women time on deck. He let them breathe fresh air, wash their clothes, and see the sky. At ports along the way, Tenerife, Rio de Janeiro, Cape Town, he allowed trade and resupply, bringing aboard fresh fruit, meat, and even livestock. This kindness was not charity, it was survival, and it worked. By the time the ship reached Australia, almost all of its passengers were still alive, a rare miracle in an era when death was expected. Still, the journey was long, 10 months at sea, and for Mary, it was a transformation. When she boarded the ship, she was a terrified child. By the time she stepped off, she was something else entirely. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The women grew strong through routine, scrubbing the decks, mending sails, caring for the sick. Some found companionship, others found faith. Many gave birth during the voyage, others mourned those who didn't survive childbirth. The ocean became their prison, but also their teacher. It taught them patience, endurance, and the will to keep breathing, even when everything inside them wanted to stop. Mary learned quickly. She listened, observed, and adapted. She was quiet, perhaps withdrawn, but her eyes missed nothing. Somewhere deep within her, the spark of survival, the one that had carried her through Newgate, began to burn again. The sea had a way of stripping people down to their essence. For some, it broke them. For others, like Mary Wade, it forged them. By June 1790, after nearly a year, the horizon finally changed. The endless blue turned green. The smell of salt gave way to the scent of earth. After 10 brutal months, the Lady Juliana reached Sydney Cove, a tiny settlement clinging to the edge of a vast, alien continent. But what awaited them was not freedom. It was chaos. The colony was on the brink of collapse. Food was scarce, disease was rampant. The settlers were weak and starving. The arrival of the Lady Juliana, filled with hundreds of women, was met not with celebration, but with frustration. The governor, Arthur Phillip, had no supplies to spare, no shelter to offer. Within days, many of the new arrivals, including Mary, were loaded onto smaller boats and sent even farther into the Pacific, their destination, Norfolk Island. It was supposed to be a place of opportunity, a farming outpost meant to ease the pressure on the struggling Sydney settlement. But for those who were sent there, it became something else entirely. Remote, wild, unforgiving. The Lady Juliana had brought Mary halfway across the world. Now Norfolk Island would decide whether she lived or died. Somewhere on that restless sea, as the smaller ship carried her toward her new fate, Mary might have looked up at the stars, the same stars she had once seen from the alleys of Westminster, and wondered how she had come this far. She had escaped the hangman's noose, survived a floating prison, and crossed an ocean that had claimed thousands. She was no longer the girl who had stolen to eat. She was a survivor of the impossible, but in the years to come, the world would test her again, harder than ever before. The small ship that carried Mary Wade from Sydney to Norfolk Island cut through rough Pacific waters, its wooden frame creaking under the weight of wind and waves. For most aboard, it was a journey into the unknown, to a place few in the world had even heard of, and even fewer had ever escaped. When the island finally came into view, it didn't look like salvation. It looked like exile. From the deck, Mary saw towering cliffs rising straight out of the sea, covered in dense forest. Waves exploded against the black rocks below. There was no soft beach, no welcoming harbor, just jagged stone and an ocean that seemed eager to swallow everything that approached. This was Norfolk Island, Britain's distant penal outpost. A speck of green and shadow, halfway between Australia and New Zealand. Established only a few years earlier, it was meant to be a small agricultural colony, a place to grow crops for the starving settlement at Sydney Cove. But isolation had turned it into something darker. There were no cities, no safety, and no mercy. Just a handful of soldiers, a few settlers, and hundreds of convicts trying to survive under a sky that seemed to close in on you. And now, Mary was one of them. Life on Norfolk Island was brutal. Every day began before sunrise, with the sound of chains clattering and guards shouting orders. Convicts were forced to clear thick jungle by hand, hacking through vines with crude axes, their skin torn and blistered. The soil was rocky and unforgiving. Rain poured in torrents, turning the camps into rivers of mud. When the sun came out, the heat was suffocating. Punishments were cruel and constant: lashings, hard labor, starvation. A single word of defiance could mean a day at the whipping post. And yet, somehow, amid this relentless cruelty, life found a way to continue. Mary was still just a teenager, 15 years old, smaller than most of the others, but tougher than anyone realized. She learned quickly that survival meant silence. You did what you were told. You worked until your hands bled. You kept your head down, and you endured. Over time, she began to carve out a kind of existence. The women cooked, washed, and tended small gardens when they could. The island was harsh, but it offered small mercies: fresh air, clear water, and distance from the disease-ridden streets of London. Somewhere in those early years, Mary met another convict, a man whose name has been lost to time. What we do know is that she gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Sarah, around 1793. She was 16. To give birth in such a place, far from any midwife or doctor, with nothing but rough blankets and the whispers of other women, was an act of sheer courage. In the middle of the Pacific, a child was born, and a young convict became a mother. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change everything. Years passed, and Mary had another child, a son, William. By then, she had learned how to survive the island's moods: when to work, when to stay quiet, and when to fight for her place. The soldiers who ruled the colony often treated the convicts with contempt, but even they began to see the determination in this young woman who never gave up. The settlers, too, relied on the convicts for survival. Everyone on Norfolk Island, soldier, farmer, or prisoner, was trapped together by the same ocean, bound by the same fragile thread of existence. In that strange, isolated world, class and crime began to blur. A thief could become a farmer, a convict could become a mother, and a girl who had once waited for the hangman's rope could become the heart of a growing community. After several years on the island, a decision came down from the governor in Sydney. Some of the convicts would be returned to the mainland to help expand the colony. Among them was Mary Wade. She had survived the impossible, from the death sentence in London to the storms of the Pacific to the endless labor of Norfolk Island. Now, she would face something new, the chance to live again. But what awaited her on the mainland was not a home. It was a wilderness. Sydney, in the 1790s, was still little more than a scattering of tents and timber huts clinging to the edges of the bush. When Mary arrived, she lived near a small stream that flowed through the settlement, the Tank Stream, the colony's main source of fresh water. There, she built a makeshift tent for herself and her children. She washed clothes, cooked, cleaned, anything to earn food or a few coins. Every sunrise, the city around her grew More ships, more settlers, more convicts arriving from across the world. And slowly, Mary began to build something that resembled a life. She was still marked by her past. A convict, a mother without freedom. But she had already proven that she could outlast anything. And soon, her story would take another turn. Because it was in this new settlement, amid the muddy roads and crude timber huts, that Mary would meet a man who would change everything. A man named Jonathan Brooker. He was a convict too. Older, stronger, a craftsman by trade. He worked as a chairmaker, carving shapes out of rough wood with the same patience life had forced on him. The two were drawn together, not by romance or chance, but by something deeper, the instinct of survival. Together, they would build not just a home, but a legacy. From the shadows of Norfolk Island, Mary Wade had emerged not as a victim, but as a survivor. And in the new land of Australia, she was about to become something more. When Mary Wade first met Jonathan Brooker, the colony of New South Wales was still more dream than reality. The year was somewhere in the early 1800s, and Sydney was nothing like the great city it would one day become. It was a rough, muddy settlement, carved from bushland and sweat. Tents and timber huts dotted the hillsides. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Chickens wandered freely through the dirt streets. For most of its inhabitants, soldiers, convicts, and a few free settlers, life was a daily negotiation with survival. Food was scarce, medicine primitive, and the law merciless. And yet, amid this uncertainty, something remarkable was happening. A new kind of society was forming, not of privilege or birthright, but of endurance. The people who built early Australia weren't aristocrats or scholars. They were men and women who had endured everything and refused to be broken. Mary Wade was one of them. Jonathan Brooker was not a wealthy man, nor a free one when they met. He too had been sent to the colonies in chains, a convict from England who had worked his way into the growing settlement as a chairmaker and craftsman. He was older than Mary, quieter perhaps, shaped by the same harsh lessons she had learned. That trust was earned slowly, and survival required both strength and partnership. Together they built something rare in a place where most people had lost everything, a family, grounded in shared hardship and stubborn hope. By the early 1800s, Mary was no longer the frightened girl who had once stood trembling before a judge in the Old Bailey. She was a woman of resilience, with children to feed and a life to defend. The colony, still starved for stability, began offering small plots of land to those willing to work them. It was a chance, not for riches, but for roots. And so, Mary and Jonathan moved to the Hawkesbury River District, northwest of Sydney, a place of rolling green hills and fertile soil, but also of danger. The Hawkesbury was known for its floods. The river could rise without warning, swallowing homes, crops, and livestock in hours. The settlers lived in constant fear of losing everything, but the land was good, rich enough to grow wheat, corn, and hope. Mary and Jonathan took their chance. They built a small homestead out of rough timber, planting what little seeds they could afford. Mary tended to the garden, the cooking, and the children. Jonathan crafted furniture for nearby settlers. Sturdy chairs and tables made from the wood of eucalyptus and cedar. It was hard work, brutal work. But for the first time in her life, Mary was free. In 1812, Mary received something she had once believed impossible, a certificate of freedom. The paper was small, simple, and easily torn. But to her, it meant everything. It meant that her sentence was served, that the girl condemned to hang at 13 was now, at 37, a free woman in a new world. The document bore her name in faded ink, proof that she had outlasted the system that once tried to destroy her. For the first time, her life belonged to her. Freedom, however, did not make life easy. The Hawkesbury was unforgiving. Floods destroyed crops. Fires razed homes. Insects devoured the fields. There were years when the family barely survived, patching together meals from whatever they could salvage. In 1823, disaster struck. A bushfire swept through the valley, devouring everything in its path. The flames tore across their farm, leaving nothing but blackened earth and the charred remains of their home. For many, it would have been the end, but not for Mary and Jonathan. They started over. They moved south, to a place called the Illawarra region, near what is now Wollongong. The soil there was softer, the land lush and green, stretching all the way to the coast. For the first time, the world around them felt alive, forgiving. They built a new house. Stronger this time. Jonathan worked the wood, and Mary worked the earth. Together they raised animals, grew vegetables, and raised a growing brood of children. Mary would give birth to 21 children in her lifetime. 14 of them would survive to adulthood, a miracle in an age when disease and hunger took so many. Their family grew into a small village of its own, filled with laughter, work, and the kind of chaos only a house with 20 children could hold. Every sunrise began the same. The sound of roosters crowing, the smell of smoke from the kitchen fire, and the sight of Mary moving among her children, a figure of quiet strength and worn patience. She had become the matriarch of a growing Australian family, her hands rough from years of labor, her eyes still carrying the memories of the streets of London and the storms of the Pacific. To her children, she was simply mother. To history, she would become something far greater. By the time the 1830s arrived, the colony had begun to change. Roads were being built, farms were prospering, convicts were being granted freedom in greater numbers. But for Mary Wade, the true transformation had already happened long ago, not in the courts or the colonies, but within herself. She had learned to turn suffering into strength, loss into love, and punishment into purpose. Every wooden chair her husband built, every furrow she planted, every child she raised, all of it became part of the foundation of a new nation. She may never have imagined it then, but her bloodline would one day run through thousands of Australians, from farmers to teachers, builders to soldiers, and even one future prime minister. But for now, Mary Wade lived simply, a free woman, a mother, and a survivor. She and Jonathan grew older together in the soft hills of Illawarra, surrounded by children and grandchildren. The land was still hard, but it was theirs. The laughter of her family echoed through the valleys where once there had been only bushland and silence. For the first time, Mary had something the world could never take away: peace. But her story was not yet over, because before her final chapter, she would face one more test: the passing of time itself, and the question of what legacy a single life could truly leave behind. By the time Mary Wade reached her 60th year, she had lived many lives: the poor child of Westminster, the condemned thief, the prisoner of Newgate, the survivor of the Lady Juliana, the mother of Norfolk Island, the settler of Hawkesbury, and finally, the free woman of Illawarra. She had crossed oceans, outlived an empire's punishment, and built a new life from nothing but willpower and work. But her greatest creation, the one history would remember her for, was not her endurance, it was her family. By the 1840s, the colony of New South Wales was no longer the ragged frontier it had been when Mary first arrived. Sydney was growing rapidly, with brick buildings, cobbled streets, and bustling markets. Convicts were fewer now. Immigrants were arriving by choice, not chains. The Australia Mary Wade lived to see was changing before her eyes, from a prison to a promise. And through it all, her children thrived. Mary's family was already legendary in size. She had given birth to 21 children, of whom 14 survived to adulthood, an extraordinary number in a time when even one child lost to fever could break a family. Her descendants were everywhere. Her sons became farmers, carpenters, and laborers, who worked the land she had once helped tame. Her daughters became mothers of their own sprawling families. Every few years, another wedding, another baby, another generation bearing the blood of the girl who had once faced the gallows. Her home in Fairy Meadow, near Wollongong, became a gathering place, a small wooden house surrounded by fields and the laughter of children. The younger ones would sit at her feet as she worked, listening to stories they could hardly believe. They'd ask her, "Grandma, is it true you came from a ship, from the other side of the world?" And she would smile, her hands still busy with her stitching, her voice soft but steady. "Aye," she'd say, "I came on a ship. The sea was wide and the world was cruel, but I made it here, didn't I?" To them, she wasn't a convict. She was the beginning of everything. In those later years, Mary Wade became something more than just a mother or grandmother. She became a symbol of survival. To the settlers who knew her story, she was living proof that the condemned could become the creators of a new world. She was a quiet woman, by all accounts, rarely speaking of her early years in London or the horrors of Newgate. But she didn't need to. Her silence carried its own kind of power. Every time she looked at her family, the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren running through the grass, she saw the proof that her suffering had not been in vain. Life in the Illawarra was still far from easy. The settlers battled floods, bushfires, and droughts. But compared to what Mary had endured, these were small hardships, the kind you faced with patience, not fear. The land had finally given her something the world had once denied her: stability. Her partner, Jonathan Brooker, grew old beside her. Together they watched their family grow, their children marrying and moving across the colony, from the Hawkesbury to the Shoalhaven, from Sydney to the far reaches of the countryside. By mid-century, there were hundreds of descendants of Mary Wade alive across New South Wales. A few of them would go on to own land, start businesses, and shape the small, growing towns that dotted the coast. In a strange way, the legacy of that one stolen bundle of clothes, the act that had condemned Mary, had become the seed of a lineage that would help build a nation. As the years passed, her name began to carry weight, not the infamy of a criminal record, but the reverence of ancestry. In the early 1850s, visitors to Fairy Meadow would sometimes meet her, a small, silver-haired woman with a quiet strength in her eyes. Her voice, though softened by age, still carried traces of London's accent, though it had been decades since she'd last seen that fog-choked city. When she looked out across the green hills of Illawarra, the land stretching down to the sea, she must have thought of how far she'd come. She had once been a girl condemned to die. Now she was a matriarch, the mother of hundreds. If she ever wondered about the life she might have lived had she stayed in England, if she imagined what might have become of that barefoot girl in Westminster, she never said. Mary Wade didn't look backward anymore. The world had moved forward with her. By 1859, she was 84 years old. Her hands were thin, her steps slow, but her mind was still sharp. On the 17th of December, the same day she had been born 84 years earlier, Mary Wade passed away peacefully in Fairy Meadow, surrounded by her family. Her funeral was the first ever held at St. Paul's Church of England, a modest chapel built on land donated by one of her sons. The church bells rang softly over the fields, the sound carrying across the valley where her children had once played. More than 300 of her descendants were alive at the time of her death. Hundreds more would follow in the decades to come. Today, historians and genealogists estimate that tens of thousands of Australians trace their ancestry back to Mary Wade. Among them are farmers, builders, teachers, doctors, and even one who would rise to become Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, her great-great-great-great-grandson. Her blood runs through the veins of a nation that once saw her as nothing more than a criminal child. Mary Wade's life is more than a footnote in history. It is a mirror held up to the early story of Australia itself, a land built by the punished, the poor, and the forgotten, who turned exile into endurance and survival into legacy. She began as a number in a prison ledger. She ended as a legend of resilience. Even now, over 2 centuries later, her story continues to echo. In the family reunions held by her descendants, in the plaques and archives that bear her name, and in the whispered stories passed down through generations. She was only a girl, but she built a nation. The ocean that once carried Mary Wade away from everything she knew is quiet now. The sea that roared against the sides of the Lady Juliana, that endless stretch of blue separating despair from destiny, it still moves, still breathes, still remembers. Somewhere in its depths, it holds the whispers of thousands like her, the forgotten, the condemned, the broken souls who were thrown across the world to a land that was meant to erase them. But it didn't. Australia did not erase them. It became them. In the 18th century, the British Empire sent more than 160,000 convicts to the colonies of Australia. Most were poor, uneducated, and desperate, victims of a world where poverty itself was treated as a crime. They were branded, chained, and shipped away, out of sight, out of mind. The empire thought it was sending away its problems. In truth, it was sowing the seeds of a new kind of strength. Men and women like Mary Wade were never meant to build a future. They were meant to disappear. But history has a strange sense of justice. Those who were once erased became the architects of a new world. For generations, Australians were taught to forget the convict past, to see it as shameful, as something best left unspoken. But time changes everything. And today, that shame has turned to pride. Because in the struggle of those early settlers, in the hunger, the exile, the punishment, there was also courage, endurance, and something even greater, transformation. Mary Wade's story stands at the heart of that transformation. She was not a queen or a politician. She wasn't educated or wealthy or powerful. She was a poor girl from the alleys of Westminster who stole to survive. And yet, she became one of the founding mothers of a nation. Her life is the proof that even the smallest voice, even the most forgotten soul, can echo through centuries. When we speak her name now, we don't just remember one woman. We remember a world. We remember the dark corners of London where children begged for bread. We remember the creaking ships that carried dreams and despair in equal measure. We remember the forests of Norfolk Island, where survival was the only law. We remember the fields of Hawkesbury, the floods, the fires, the rebuilding. And finally, we remember the gentle hills of Illawarra, where the girl who had been condemned to die finally found peace. Mary Wade's descendants number in the tens of thousands. If you trace her lineage today, you'll find her story running through every layer of Australian society, from farms to universities, from the coast to the outback. Each of them carries a spark of her defiance, her will to live, her refusal to be defined by what the world once said she was. In every sense, she embodies the spirit of the land she helped build. Harsh, vast, but full of life. History often celebrates the generals, the explorers, the kings. But sometimes, the real builders of nations are the ones who had nothing, the ones who carried more scars than titles. Mary Wade never wrote her story. She didn't have the chance, but it was written all the same, in the soil she turned, in the lives she brought into the world, in the resilience that her bloodline would carry forward for centuries. She is not a symbol of crime or punishment. She is a symbol of redemption. In every generation, there are those who are cast aside. People the world decides are too small, too poor, or too broken to matter. Mary Wade's story reminds us that those people do matter, that greatness is not born from privilege, but from perseverance. The truth is, the world is full of Mary Wades. They live in every age, in every country. People who face impossible odds and still find a way to build something that lasts. Her story is not just history, it's a mirror. A reflection of what we are capable of when we refuse to give up. In the quiet of Fairy Meadow, the earth still holds her. The same land she once tilled, the same ground where she raised her children, now cradles her in eternal rest. St. Paul's Church, the one her family helped build, still stands today. If you listen closely on a calm morning, you might imagine her voice in the wind, the faint laughter of her children carried on the sea breeze. A reminder that even from the darkest beginnings, life can take root. That even a girl condemned to die can live on through generations. That sometimes the people the world forgets become the ones it can never erase. And so, when we speak of Australia, of its harsh beauty, its resilience, its unbreakable spirit, we are in some small way speaking of her, the child who stole to survive, the convict who crossed the world, the woman who became the mother of a nation. Her name was Mary Wade. And her story will never die. If stories like this remind you how much one life can change the world, consider staying with us. There are countless forgotten names buried beneath history, and we're here to bring them back to light. So if you'd like to hear more tales of survival, mystery, and the untold past, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this story with someone who still believes that hope can grow from the harshest soil. Because in the end, that's what Mary Wade taught us. No matter how far you fall, you can always rise again.